Picture this. You're awakened at 2 a.m. by the harsh clang of a bell, your feet hitting freezing stone floors as you stumble toward a dark chapel for the first of 7 daily prayers. Your stomach gnaws with hunger from yesterday's meager meal of bread and watery soup. This isn't a nightmare. This was daily life for medieval monks. Welcome to another episode of Boring History for Sleep, where we explore the fascinating yet brutal realities of medieval monastery life. Tonight, we'll journey through the harsh disciplines, extreme punishments, and surprisingly complex social hierarchies that defined monastic existence from the 6th to 15th centuries. From the moment they entered monastery walls, monks surrendered everything: their possessions, their families, even their names. They embraced a life of poverty, chastity, and obedience that would make modern minimalists seem indulgent. But beneath the spiritual devotion lay a world of physical hardship, psychological pressure, and sometimes shocking cruelty. We'll discover how monks survived on starvation rations, endured brutal physical punishments for minor infractions, and navigated the treacherous politics of religious communities. You'll learn about the backbreaking labor that filled their days, the ingenious methods they used to preserve knowledge, and the surprising ways they influenced medieval society. So settle in comfortably as we explore the shadowy corridors and candlelit cells where faith and suffering intertwined in ways that would forever shape Western civilization. To understand the brutal reality of monastic life, we must first journey back to the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. As barbarian tribes swept across Europe, destroying cities and dismantling the sophisticated infrastructure that had sustained civilization for centuries, the continent plunged into what historians would later call the Dark Ages. In this chaos, the Catholic Church emerged as the sole institution capable of preserving knowledge and maintaining some semblance of order. Monasteries became islands of stability in a sea of violence and uncertainty. But this stability came at an extraordinary personal cost for those who chose to dedicate their lives to God. The monastic movement had its roots in the deserts of Egypt and Syria, where early Christian hermits like Saint Anthony the Great retreated from the world to live in extreme asceticism. These desert fathers believed that only through complete renunciation of worldly pleasures could one achieve spiritual purification and draw closer to the divine. Saint Benedict of Nursia, writing in the 6th century, would formalize these principles into what became known as the Rule of Saint Benedict. This document, consisting of 73 short chapters, would govern monastic life for over 1,000 years and establish the foundation for the brutal regimen that defined medieval monasticism. Benedict's rule was revolutionary in its comprehensiveness. It dictated every aspect of a monk's existence, from the moment he awakened before dawn to the instant he fell asleep on his hard straw mattress. The rule emphasized 3 fundamental vows that would shape every moment of monastic life: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty meant the complete renunciation of personal possessions. A monk could own nothing, not even the rough woolen habit he wore, or the simple wooden bowl from which he ate his meager meals. Everything belonged to the community, and the community belonged to God. This wasn't merely about material deprivation. It was about the systematic destruction of individual identity and desire. Chastity extended far beyond sexual abstinence. Monks were forbidden from forming close personal relationships with anyone, including their fellow brothers. Conversations were limited to essential communications about work or prayer. Physical contact was strictly prohibited, except in cases of medical necessity. Even eye contact was discouraged as a potential source of temptation or distraction from devotion to God. But perhaps most crushing of all was the vow of obedience. A monk surrendered his will entirely to his abbot, who served as God's representative on earth within the monastery walls. No decision was too small to require permission. A monk could not eat, sleep, work, or even speak without explicit authorization from his superior. The daily schedule, known as the Horarium, was designed to break down human nature itself. Monks rose at 2 in the morning for the first prayer service, called Matins. In the bitter cold of winter, they would stumble through darkness to the chapel, their breath visible in the frigid air as they chanted Latin psalms by flickering candlelight. After Matins came lauds at dawn, followed by prime at 6 in the morning. Then came terce at 9, sext at noon, none at 3 in the afternoon, vespers at sunset, and finally compline before sleep. 8 prayer services every single day, each lasting between 30 minutes and 2 hours, depending on the season and the complexity of the liturgy. Between these prayer services, monks engaged in manual labor that was both physically demanding and spiritually significant. They cleared forests, drained swamps, built massive stone churches with their bare hands, and cultivated fields using primitive tools. This work was not merely economic necessity. It was considered essential for spiritual development. The monastery itself was designed as a self-contained world, cut off from the outside by high walls and strict regulations. Once a man entered as a novice, he might never leave again. The architecture reinforced this isolation, with long corridors that echoed with the sound of sandaled feet, small cells barely large enough for a sleeping mat, and communal spaces designed to minimize privacy and individual expression. Food was scarce and deliberately unappetizing. The rule of Saint Benedict prescribed 2 meals per day during most of the year, and only 1 meal during the penitential seasons of Lent and Advent. These meals consisted primarily of bread, vegetables, and thin gruel, with meat forbidden except for the sick and dying. Salt was used sparingly, and spices were considered luxurious distractions from spiritual contemplation. Sleep deprivation was systematic and intentional. Monks typically slept only 4 to 6 hours per night, often less during religious festivals and penitential periods. They slept fully clothed on hard surfaces, ready to rise instantly for prayer. The dormitory was kept deliberately cold, with minimal heating even in the depths of winter. Physical comfort was viewed as an obstacle to spiritual growth. Monks wore the same rough woolen habit year-round, regardless of weather. They walked barefoot or in simple sandals, even through snow and mud. Bathing was rare and considered potentially sinful, as it might lead to vanity or sensual pleasure. The psychological pressure was perhaps even more intense than the physical hardships. Monks lived under constant surveillance, with every action scrutinized for signs of spiritual weakness or disobedience. They were encouraged to report each other's failings to the abbot, creating an atmosphere of mistrust and paranoia that prevented the formation of supportive relationships. Punishment for infractions was swift and severe. Minor offenses might result in reduced food rations, additional manual labor, or temporary exclusion from communal prayer. More serious violations could lead to public humiliation, physical beatings, or solitary confinement in a cell barely large enough to stand upright. The ultimate punishment was excommunication from the monastery, which meant not only loss of one's spiritual community, but often death from starvation or exposure in the hostile world outside. This threat hung over every monk's head, creating a constant state of anxiety and vigilance. Yet thousands of men chose this life, driven by genuine religious conviction, family pressure, or simple lack of alternatives in a world where opportunities for advancement were extremely limited. Some were drawn by the promise of education and access to books, as monasteries were among the few places where literacy was preserved and cultivated. The irony was that while individual monks suffered tremendously, the monastic system as a whole became incredibly powerful and wealthy. Monasteries accumulated vast land holdings through donations and bequests, becoming major economic and political forces in medieval society. The brothers who worked these lands saw little benefit from their labor, living in poverty while their institutions grew rich. This historical context sets the stage for understanding just how brutal daily life could be for medieval monks. They lived in a world where suffering was not just accepted, but actively sought as a path to salvation, where individual desires were systematically crushed in service of a higher spiritual purpose, and where the human cost of religious devotion was measured not in comfort or happiness, but in the complete surrender of self to divine will. The roots of Christian monasticism stretch back to the scorching deserts of 3rd century Egypt, where men and women fled civilization in search of divine communion through extreme asceticism. These desert fathers and mothers, known as hermits or anchorites, lived in complete isolation, surviving on dates, bread, and water, while spending their days in prayer and contemplation. Saint Anthony of Egypt, often called the father of monasticism, retreated to an abandoned fort in the desert around 270 AD, where he battled demons, both literal and metaphorical, for nearly 20 years. The harsh reality of hermit life was almost incomprehensible by modern standards. These early ascetics wore hair shirts that scratched constantly against their skin, slept on beds of thorns, and deliberately exposed themselves to scorching desert heat and freezing nights. They believed that by mortifying their flesh, they could purify their souls and achieve mystical union with God. Some hermits went to such extremes that they developed severe malnutrition, hallucinations, and physical deformities from their self-imposed suffering. As word of these desert dwellers spread throughout the Christian world, pilgrims began seeking them out for spiritual guidance. The hermit's reputation for holiness attracted followers who wanted to learn their methods of prayer and penance. However, the completely solitary life proved too difficult for many aspiring monks, leading to the development of semi-communal arrangements where hermits lived in loose clusters, meeting occasionally for worship and mutual support. Saint Pachomius, an Egyptian monk of the early 4th century, recognized the need for a more structured approach to monastic life. Around 320 AD, he established the first organized monastery at Tbilisi in Upper Egypt, creating a revolutionary system where monks lived together under a common rule. This communal monasticism, known as Cenobitic life, provided the blueprint for virtually all future monastic communities. Pachomius wrote detailed regulations covering everything from daily schedules to sleeping arrangements, establishing the foundation for monastic discipline that would endure for centuries. The Pachomian monasteries were essentially self-contained villages where hundreds of monks lived, worked, and prayed together. These communities operated workshops for weaving, carpentry, and metalwork, generating income while keeping the monks productively occupied. The daily routine was rigidly structured, beginning before dawn with communal prayers, and continuing through assigned work periods, meals eaten in silence, and evening devotions. Monks were organized into houses based on their skills and trades, creating an efficient system of labor division that would later influence medieval economic organization. As monasticism spread from Egypt throughout the Byzantine Empire and into Western Europe, different regions developed their own variations and interpretations. In Syria and Palestine, monks often lived in caves carved into cliff sides, creating vertical communities that dotted the landscape like spiritual beehives. These Syrian monks were known for their extreme ascetic practices, including stylites who lived on top of pillars for years at a time, surviving on food hauled up in baskets by devoted followers. The arrival of monasticism in Western Europe brought new challenges and adaptations. Saint Martin of Tours, a former Roman soldier, established the first monastery in Gaul around 360 AD, adapting Eastern monastic practices to the cooler, wetter climate and different social conditions of Western Europe, unlike the desert monasteries that could rely on year-round growing seasons. European monasteries had to develop more sophisticated agricultural techniques and food preservation methods to survive harsh winters. Ireland became a particularly important center of early medieval monasticism, where Celtic monks developed their own distinctive traditions. Irish monasteries served as centers of learning and manuscript preservation during the chaos following the fall of the Roman Empire. These Irish monks, known for their scholarly pursuits and missionary zeal, established monasteries throughout Scotland, northern England, and continental Europe, carrying with them illuminated manuscripts and advanced knowledge of Latin, Greek, and various sciences. The most influential figure in Western monasticism was undoubtedly Saint Benedict of Nursia, who founded the monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy around 529 AD. Benedict's genius lay not in creating something entirely new, but in synthesizing the best elements of existing monastic traditions into a practical, moderate rule that could be adapted to different circumstances and cultures. The Rule of Saint Benedict, consisting of 73 short chapters, provided detailed guidance for every aspect of monastic life, while maintaining enough flexibility to accommodate local conditions. Benedict's rule emphasized the importance of stability, meaning that monks should remain in one monastery for their entire lives, rather than wandering from place to place. This concept of stability was revolutionary because it created permanent communities that could develop long-term agricultural projects, accumulate libraries, and build lasting relationships with surrounding secular communities. The rule also established the principle of conversatio morum, or conversion of life, requiring monks to continuously strive for spiritual improvement through prayer, work, and study. The Benedictine emphasis on manual labor was particularly significant in shaping medieval European society. Unlike classical Roman culture, which viewed physical work as suitable only for slaves, Benedict declared that monks should support themselves through their own labor. This elevation of manual work to a spiritual discipline helped transform European attitudes toward agriculture, craftsmanship, and technological innovation. Benedictine monasteries became centers of agricultural experimentation, developing new farming techniques, crop rotation systems, and water management technologies. The spread of Benedictine monasticism across Europe was facilitated by the support of powerful rulers who saw monasteries as useful allies in consolidating their authority. Charlemagne, in particular, promoted monastic reform and standardization throughout his empire, recognizing that monasteries could serve as administrative centers, schools, and sources of literate personnel for his government. This alliance between monastic communities and secular rulers would prove crucial in shaping the political and cultural development of medieval Europe. By the 9th century, monasteries had become some of the wealthiest and most powerful institutions in Europe, controlling vast estates and wielding significant political influence. The Benedictine Abbey of Cluny, founded in 910 AD, exemplified this transformation from simple religious communities to major economic and political powers. Cluny and its affiliated monasteries owned thousands of acres of farmland, controlled important trade routes, and maintained diplomatic relationships with kings and popes across Europe. However, this worldly success came at a cost to the original monastic ideals of poverty, simplicity, and spiritual focus. Many monasteries became so wealthy and politically involved that they began to resemble secular institutions more than religious communities. Monks lived in comfortable quarters, ate elaborate meals, and spent more time managing their estates than engaging in prayer and contemplation. This drift from monastic ideals would eventually provoke reform movements and the founding of new, more austere monastic orders. The tension between monastic ideals and worldly success created a recurring cycle throughout medieval history, where reformers would establish new communities dedicated to returning to original principles of poverty and simplicity, only to see these communities eventually accumulate wealth and power themselves. This pattern would repeat with the Cistercians, Franciscans, and other reform movements, each attempting to recapture the authentic spirit of early monasticism while adapting to changing social and economic conditions. Understanding these origins helps explain why medieval monastic life was characterized by such apparent contradictions between spiritual ideals and harsh realities. The monks will explore lived within institutions that had evolved over centuries, carrying the weight of accumulated traditions, expectations, and compromises that often made their daily lives far more complex and challenging than the simple desert hermitages from which monasticism first emerged. The monastery bell tower loomed against the pre-dawn darkness, its bronze bell waiting to shatter the silence of sleeping monks. At precisely 2 o'clock in the morning, the bell ringer would climb the narrow stone steps, his bare feet silent on the worn granite. The first toll would echo through the dormitory corridors, a deep, resonant sound that penetrated even the deepest sleep. Brother Thomas stirred in his narrow wooden bed, the straw mattress crackling beneath him as consciousness slowly returned. The cell was pitch black, no windows to reveal the world outside, only the sound of the bell, counting out the hours until it reached the designated number. Around him, 40 other monks began their own reluctant awakening, bodies stiff from the hard sleeping surfaces and thin woolen blankets. This was Matins, the first of 8 daily prayer services that would structure every moment of monastic life. The rule of Saint Benedict was clear. Prayer came before comfort, before warmth, before the basic human desire to remain asleep. Thomas swung his legs over the side of his bed, feet finding the cold stone floor. In the darkness, he could hear the shuffling of sandals, the quiet coughs of elderly brothers, the whispered prayers of those already preparing their souls for worship. The dormitory held no privacy, no individual space beyond the narrow bed and small wooden chest that contained each monk's few possessions. 40 men shared this long rectangular room with its high vaulted ceiling and small windows placed too high to see through. The air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and the lingering smoke from the previous evening's candles. Brother Thomas reached for his habit, the same coarse brown woolen garment he wore every day. The fabric was rough against his skin, intentionally uncomfortable to remind him of his earthly suffering. Beneath it, he wore a simple linen tunic and woolen undergarments that were changed perhaps once a week, if at all. His feet went into leather sandals worn thin by years of walking on stone floors. The procession to the chapel began in silence. 40 monks filed through the narrow corridors, their sandals creating a rhythmic shuffling sound against the stone. The monastery was a maze of passages, each one leading to different areas of monastic life. The chapel stood at the center, its heavy wooden doors already open to receive the faithful. Inside, the chapel was illuminated by dozens of candles, their flickering light casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. The altar was simple, adorned only with a wooden crucifix and a few precious metal vessels. The monks took their places in the wooden choir stalls, arranged in 2 rows facing each other across the narrow aisle. Matins lasted for nearly 2 hours. The monks chanted in Latin, their voices rising and falling in ancient melodies that had been sung for centuries. Brother Thomas knew every word by heart, but the repetition was intentional. The familiar prayers were meant to quiet the mind, to focus the soul entirely on divine contemplation. His stomach growled softly, but he ignored it. Hunger was simply another form of spiritual discipline. When Matins concluded, the monks did not return to bed. Instead, they had a brief period for private prayer and meditation before the next service. Brother Thomas knelt in his assigned spot, a small alcove near the chapel wall. The stone was cold against his knees, but he remained motionless, hands clasped in prayer. Around him, other monks did the same, creating a tableau of silent devotion. At 5 o'clock, the bell rang again for lauds, the morning prayer service. This was followed by prime at 6 o'clock, then terce at 9. Between these services, the monks had their first meal of the day, a simple affair that would barely satisfy a modern person's idea of breakfast. The refectory was a long, narrow hall with wooden tables and benches worn smooth by generations of use. Brother Thomas took his assigned seat, the same place he had occupied for the past 7 years. A younger monk, serving as reader for the week, stood at a raised platform and began reciting from scripture. No conversation was permitted during meals. The only sounds were the quiet scraping of wooden spoons against clay bowls and the steady drone of the reader's voice. The meal consisted of a thin porridge made from barley and oats, perhaps with a small piece of bread if the harvest had been good. On feast days, there might be a small portion of fish or cheese, but such luxuries were rare. Brother Thomas ate slowly, savoring each spoonful not for its taste, but as an act of gratitude. The rule of Saint Benedict taught that even the simplest food was a gift from God. Water was the only beverage, drawn from the monastery's well and served in simple clay cups. Wine was reserved for special occasions and was always heavily watered. The monks believed that alcohol clouded the mind and interfered with spiritual contemplation. Even this small amount of food was considered sufficient, as excessive eating was seen as a form of gluttony. After the morning meal, the monks dispersed to their assigned work. Brother Thomas made his way to the scriptorium, where he spent his days copying manuscripts. The room was filled with wooden desks, each equipped with the tools of the scribe's trade: quills, ink, parchment, and small knives for scraping away mistakes. The work was painstaking and required absolute concentration. A single page might take an entire day to complete, with each letter carefully formed and decorated. Brother Thomas specialized in copying religious texts, but the monastery also preserved classical works of literature, philosophy, and science. His fingers were permanently stained with ink, and his back ached from hunching over the desk for hours at a time. The scriptorium was cold in winter and stifling in summer. There was no heating except for small braziers that provided minimal warmth, and the windows were kept open for light regardless of the weather. Brother Thomas wore fingerless gloves to maintain his grip on the quill while keeping his hands from freezing. In summer, sweat would drip onto the parchment, sometimes ruining hours of work. At noon, the bell rang for sext, interrupting the morning's labor. The monks filed back to the chapel for another hour of prayer and chanting. This was followed by the main meal of the day, served in the same silent refectory. The midday meal was slightly more substantial than breakfast, perhaps including vegetables from the monastery garden, or a small portion of meat on Sundays. Brother Thomas returned to his copying work until the bell rang for none at 3 o'clock. The afternoon hours were often the most challenging, as fatigue set in and the light began to fade. Candles were expensive and used sparingly, so most detailed work had to be completed during daylight hours. The monastery's daily schedule was relentless in its precision. Every moment was accounted for, every activity designed to bring the monks closer to God through discipline and devotion. There was no time for personal pursuits, no opportunity for individual expression. The community moved as one body, united in purpose and practice. As evening approached, the monks gathered for vespers, the evening prayer service. This was followed by a light supper, often just bread and water, with perhaps a small piece of cheese. The final service of the day was Compline, held just before the monks retired to their dormitory. Brother Thomas climbed the stairs to the dormitory, his body weary from the day's labors. Tomorrow would bring the same routine, the same prayers, the same simple meals. This was the rhythm of monastic life, unchanging and eternal, designed to strip away worldly concerns and focus the soul entirely on divine contemplation. In the darkness of his cell, Brother Thomas lay on his straw mattress and listened to the quiet breathing of his fellow monks. In a few hours, the bell would ring again, and the cycle would begin anew. This was his life, chosen freely, but lived within the strictest possible boundaries, a testament to the medieval belief that true spiritual growth required the complete surrender of personal will. The 3 sacred vows that bound every monk were poverty, chastity, and obedience. These weren't mere suggestions or ideals to aspire toward. They were absolute commandments that governed every aspect of monastic existence, enforced through brutal discipline and constant surveillance. Poverty meant owning nothing whatsoever. A monk couldn't possess so much as a spare tunic, a writing quill, or even a prayer book without explicit permission from his superior. Personal belongings were considered spiritual poison, temptations that would corrupt the soul's journey toward divine union. Everything belonged to the monastery, and everything was shared according to need as determined by the abbot. This vow extended beyond material possessions to encompass personal autonomy itself. A monk couldn't make decisions about his daily routine, his work assignments, or even his meals. He surrendered his will entirely to the community and its leaders. The medieval mind viewed this surrender as liberation from the burden of choice, but the practical reality was often psychological torment. Chastity demanded complete celibacy, not just in action, but in thought and desire. Medieval monasteries developed elaborate systems for monitoring and controlling sexual impulses. Monks slept in common dormitories where privacy was impossible. They were forbidden from bathing alone or removing their robes completely, even for washing. Physical contact between brothers was strictly regulated, with rules governing everything from handshakes to helping someone who had fallen. The monastery's architecture itself reinforced these restrictions. Sleeping quarters were designed with minimal privacy, often just thin partitions between beds. Windows were positioned to allow constant observation. Even the latrines were constructed to prevent solitary moments where impure thoughts might flourish. The community's vigilance was relentless and comprehensive. Obedience was perhaps the most psychologically demanding vow. It required instant, unquestioning compliance with any command from a superior, regardless of personal feelings or rational objections. A monk who hesitated, questioned, or showed reluctance faced severe punishment. This wasn't mere institutional efficiency, but a deliberate breaking of individual will, considered essential for spiritual progress. The rule of Saint Benedict outlined specific punishments for various infractions. Minor violations earned public humiliation during communal meals, where the offender would prostrate himself before the entire community while his sins were announced. More serious breaches resulted in physical punishment, reduced food rations, or temporary excommunication from religious services. Corporal punishment was routine and accepted. Monks who broke silence, arrived late to services, or showed signs of pride or rebellion were beaten with wooden rods or leather straps. The beatings weren't administered in anger, but as calculated spiritual medicine designed to drive out sin through physical suffering. The victim was expected to accept his punishment gratefully, viewing it as divine correction. The monastery's disciplinary system included a complex hierarchy of punishments. First offenses might earn a private rebuke from the abbot. Repeated violations escalated to public confession, where the monk would detail his sins before the entire community. Persistent offenders faced increasingly severe consequences, including solitary confinement, bread and water diets, or exclusion from communal prayers. Excommunication was the ultimate punishment, reserved for the most serious violations. An excommunicated monk remained physically present in the monastery, but was treated as spiritually dead. No one could speak to him, share meals with him, or acknowledge his existence. He attended services, but stood apart from the community, a living ghost whose very presence served as a warning to others. The psychological pressure of constant surveillance created an atmosphere of perpetual anxiety. Monks developed elaborate internal monitoring systems, constantly examining their thoughts and motivations for signs of sin. This self-surveillance was encouraged and rewarded, creating communities where individuals policed not only their own behavior, but that of their brothers. Confession became a weekly ordeal, where monks were required to reveal not just their actions, but their innermost thoughts and desires. The abbot, or his designated confessor, would probe for hidden sins, unacknowledged pride, or secret resentments. Nothing was too private or personal to escape scrutiny. This systematic invasion of mental privacy was considered essential for spiritual purification. The vow of stability, while not always counted among the primary 3 bound monks to their specific monastery for life. Unlike secular clergy, who might transfer between parishes, monks were permanently attached to their community. This created intense psychological pressure. as personality conflicts, institutional problems, or simple incompatibility couldn't be resolved through departure. Some monasteries developed reputations for particular harshness in enforcing discipline. The Carthusians, for example, maintained almost complete silence, with monks communicating only through predetermined hand signals. Speaking without permission earned immediate punishment, and casual conversation was forbidden entirely. Meals were eaten in complete silence, while one brother read aloud from religious texts. The Cistercians emphasized physical labor as spiritual discipline, requiring monks to work in fields and workshops, regardless of their background or physical condition. Former nobles found themselves hauling stones, digging ditches, and performing manual labor that would have been unthinkable in their previous lives. This deliberate humiliation was considered spiritually beneficial, breaking down pride and social pretension. Sleep itself became a form of discipline. Most monasteries required monks to sleep fully clothed, ready for immediate response to the night office bells. Beds were simple straw mattresses on wooden frames, deliberately uncomfortable to discourage excessive rest. Some orders required monks to sleep sitting up or on bare floors as penance for particular sins. The enforcement of these disciplines created a culture of mutual surveillance and reporting. Monks were encouraged to observe their brothers for signs of spiritual weakness or rule violations. This wasn't considered betrayal, but loving correction, helping fellow monks avoid damnation through early intervention. The system turned communities into networks of informants, where privacy was impossible and trust was dangerous. Physical mortification supplemented the basic vows with additional forms of self-punishment. Monks wore hair shirts, rough garments designed to cause constant discomfort. They practiced flagellation, whipping themselves with knotted cords or metal-tipped scourges. Some orders required members to sleep on beds of thorns or wear iron chains beneath their robes as constant reminders of their spiritual obligations. The cumulative effect of these disciplines was profound psychological transformation, though not always in the intended direction. Some monks achieved the desired spiritual detachment and inner peace. Others developed severe mental health problems, including depression, anxiety, and what modern psychology would recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. The medieval monastery had no framework for understanding or treating such conditions. Yet these harsh disciplines were considered acts of love, both divine and human. The abbot who punished a wayward monk was fulfilling his spiritual duty as a father figure, guiding his charges toward salvation. The community that enforced these rules was protecting its members from eternal damnation. The monk who submitted to discipline was demonstrating his commitment to spiritual growth and his trust in divine wisdom. This system of vows and disciplines created men who were simultaneously broken and transformed, stripped of individual identity, yet supposedly elevated to higher spiritual planes. Whether this transformation represented genuine spiritual achievement or psychological damage remains a matter of interpretation. But the medieval monastery's commitment to these principles was absolute and unwavering. The physical demands of monastic life extended far beyond the spiritual challenges we've explored. Medieval monasteries were places where the body was deliberately subjected to hardship as a path to spiritual purification. The very architecture of these institutions was designed to remind monks of their mortality and the temporary nature of earthly comfort. Stone walls retained the bitter cold of winter months, while summer brought stifling heat that made the heavy woolen habits nearly unbearable. Monks slept on hard wooden planks or straw mattresses that provided little cushioning against the cold stone floors. Their cells were deliberately sparse, containing only the most basic necessities: a wooden cross, perhaps a small table for writing, and a chamber pot. The daily routine began before dawn, often at 2 or 3 in the morning for matins. Monks would stumble through darkened corridors, their bare feet or thin sandals providing little protection against the freezing stone. The chapel, while slightly warmer due to body heat, remained uncomfortably cold throughout the winter months. Standing for hours during prayers, their joints would stiffen and ache, particularly affecting older monks who had spent decades in this routine. Manual labor formed a cornerstone of monastic life, following the Benedictine principle that idleness was the enemy of the soul. Monks worked in fields, tending crops with primitive tools that required tremendous physical effort. They would spend hours bent over, weeding gardens, harvesting grain, or clearing land. Their hands became calloused and cracked, their backs permanently stooped from years of agricultural work. The monastery's scriptorium presented its own physical challenges. Monks who spent their days copying manuscripts developed severe eye strain from working by candlelight or dim natural light filtering through small windows. The constant hunching over parchment caused chronic neck and back pain. Their fingers, gripping quills for hours, would cramp and develop permanent calluses. The cold stone floors beneath their feet provided no relief during long copying sessions. Dietary restrictions compounded these physical hardships. The monastic diet was deliberately austere, consisting primarily of bread, vegetables, and occasionally fish. Meat was forbidden except for the sick or elderly. Meals were eaten in silence, with portions carefully measured to prevent gluttony. During Lent and other fasting periods, even these meager rations were reduced further. Many monks suffered from malnutrition, their bodies weakened by inadequate protein and limited caloric intake. The lack of proper nutrition manifested in various ways. Monks frequently developed scurvy from vitamin deficiencies, their gums bleeding and teeth loosening. Anemia was common, leaving them pale and weak. The combination of poor diet and physical labor often resulted in dramatic weight loss, particularly among newer monks whose bodies had not yet adapted to the harsh regimen. Medical care within monasteries was rudimentary at best. While some monasteries maintained infirmaries, treatment relied heavily on herbal remedies and prayer rather than scientific medicine. Monks suffering from injuries or illness often had to continue their duties despite pain or discomfort. The concept of rest for recovery was viewed with suspicion, as it might lead to laziness or spiritual weakness. Hygiene presented another significant challenge. Bathing was infrequent and often viewed as potentially sinful, as it involved attention to the body rather than the soul. Monks might bathe only a few times per year, leading to skin conditions, infections, and the constant presence of lice and other parasites. Their woolen habits, worn continuously, became breeding grounds for bacteria and insects. The physical isolation of many monasteries meant that monks had to be self-sufficient in all aspects of maintenance and construction. They quarried stone, built walls, repaired roofs, and maintained complex systems of drainage and water supply. These tasks required tremendous physical strength and endurance, often performed by men whose bodies were already weakened by fasting and poor nutrition. Seasonal changes brought their own particular hardships. Winter months were especially brutal, with monks rising in the pre-dawn darkness to attend prayers in unheated chapels. Their breath would form clouds in the frigid air as they chanted, their voices sometimes cracking from the cold. Frostbite was common among those assigned to outdoor duties, and many monks developed chronic respiratory conditions from constant exposure to cold and dampness. The summer months offered little relief. Heavy woolen habits became stifling in the heat, but removing them was not permitted. Monks working in fields under the blazing sun often collapsed from heat exhaustion. The combination of physical labor, inadequate hydration, and heavy clothing created dangerous conditions that monasteries simply accepted as part of their spiritual discipline. Sleep deprivation was a constant companion to physical hardship. The monastic schedule allowed for only 4 to 6 hours of sleep, broken by midnight prayers. This chronic exhaustion affected every aspect of a monk's physical well-being, slowing healing, weakening immune systems, and making them more susceptible to accidents and injuries during manual labor. Despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, many monks developed remarkable physical endurance. Their bodies, though often thin and marked by years of hardship, became adapted to the demanding routine. They developed the ability to function on minimal sleep, to work for hours despite hunger, and to find strength in their spiritual purpose even when their bodies were failing. The physical suffering was not seen as an unfortunate byproduct of monastic life, but as an essential component of spiritual development. Each ache, each moment of hunger, each shiver in the cold chapel was viewed as an opportunity to share in the sufferings of Christ purify the soul through bodily discipline. These physical hardships created a unique form of resilience among medieval monks. They learned to find peace and even joy in circumstances that would break most people. Their bodies became instruments of their faith, willingly subjected to hardship in service of a higher purpose. This physical dimension of monastic life was inseparable from their spiritual journey, creating men who were both physically tough and spiritually refined. Beyond the physical demands of monastic life lay another burden entirely: the weight of intellectual responsibility that pressed upon the minds of medieval monks. In an age where literacy was rare and books were precious beyond measure, monasteries served as the repositories of human knowledge, and monks bore the crushing responsibility of preserving civilization itself. The scriptorium stood as the intellectual heart of every monastery, a sacred space where silence reigned supreme, except for the gentle scratch of quill against parchment. Here, monks labored over manuscripts with the devotion of prayer, their backs bent for hours over writing desks that offered no comfort. The work demanded absolute precision. A single misplaced letter could corrupt a sacred text for generations to come. Brother scribes began their work before dawn, taking advantage of the precious natural light that filtered through narrow windows. Their fingers, already stiff from cold stone floors and morning prayers, had to maintain perfect control over their writing instruments. The quills required constant attention, sharpening, cleaning, replacing when they wore thin from endless use against rough parchment surfaces. The preparation of writing materials alone consumed countless hours of labor. Parchment had to be carefully prepared from animal skins, stretched and scraped until it achieved the proper smoothness and thickness. Ink required mixing from various ingredients: oak galls, iron sulfate, and gum arabic. Each batch carefully tested to ensure it would not fade or corrupt over time. The slightest variation in mixture could render weeks of copying work worthless. Illuminated manuscripts demanded even greater skill and patience. Brother illuminators spent months creating single pages, their eyes straining over intricate details that measured mere millimeters across. Gold leaf had to be applied with absolute precision, each flake carefully positioned and burnished to achieve the proper luminous effect. The pigments themselves came from exotic sources: lapis lazuli ground to powder for the deepest blues, cochineal insects for rich reds, and various mineral compounds that required dangerous preparation methods. The intellectual demands extended far beyond mere copying. Monks served as translators, working to preserve Greek and Arabic texts by rendering them into Latin. This required not just linguistic skill, but deep understanding of complex philosophical and scientific concepts. A mistranslation could introduce errors that would propagate through centuries of scholarship, making each decision a weighty responsibility. mathematical calculations consumed enormous amounts of time and mental energy. Monks calculated feast days, determined the proper dates for Easter celebrations, and maintained complex calendrical systems that governed both religious and secular life. These computations required understanding of astronomical movements, lunar cycles, and intricate mathematical relationships that challenged even the most educated minds of the era. The monastery library represented both blessing and burden. While it contained the accumulated wisdom of ages, it also demanded constant maintenance and organization. Monks cataloged every volume, noting its contents, condition, and location within the collection. Damaged books required careful restoration, with pages rebound, text restored, and protective measures implemented to prevent further deterioration. Teaching responsibilities added another layer of intellectual labor. Experienced monks instructed novices in reading, writing, and the liberal arts. They prepared lessons, corrected student work, and guided young minds through complex theological concepts. The pressure to maintain educational standards while managing their own scholarly pursuits created constant tension in monastic life. Theological scholarship demanded the highest levels of intellectual rigor. Monks engaged in detailed biblical commentary, analyzing every word and phrase for deeper meaning. They debated complex doctrinal questions, wrote treatises on spiritual matters, and contributed to the ongoing development of Christian thought. These works required extensive research, careful argumentation, and profound understanding of existing theological traditions. The burden of correspondence fell heavily upon educated monks. They drafted letters for abbots, maintained communication with other monasteries, and handled legal documents that required precise language and perfect penmanship. Royal courts often requested monastic scribes for important documents, adding secular responsibilities to their already overwhelming workload. Historical chronicles consumed years of careful compilation. Monk chroniclers gathered information from multiple sources, verified accounts through cross-reference, and maintained detailed records of contemporary events. They understood that their work would serve future generations, making accuracy and completeness essential qualities in their historical documentation. Scientific observations required both patience and precision. Monks studying astronomy spent countless nights recording celestial movements, calculating planetary positions, and maintaining complex observational records. Their work contributed to calendar reform and navigation improvements, but demanded sacrifice of sleep and comfort in pursuit of accurate data. Medical knowledge preservation represented another crucial intellectual burden. Monastery infirmaries required monks trained in healing arts, and these medical practitioners had to maintain detailed records of treatments, symptoms, and outcomes. They copied medical texts, experimented with herbal remedies, and developed new treatments while carefully documenting their discoveries for future practitioners. The psychological toll of intellectual labor proved as demanding as any physical hardship. Monks worked in isolation, spending hours alone with their thoughts and texts. The pressure to avoid errors created constant anxiety, while the slow pace of hand-copying work tested patience and mental endurance. Many suffered from what we might recognize today as repetitive strain injuries, with cramped hands and aching backs from endless hours of writing. Quality control demanded additional layers of verification. Completed manuscripts underwent careful proofreading by multiple readers, each checking for different types of errors. Corrections required careful scraping away of incorrect text and precise rewriting in matching ink and script style. The revision process often took as long as the original copying work. Seasonal variations affected intellectual productivity significantly. Winter months brought shorter days and inadequate lighting, forcing monks to work by candlelight that strained their eyes and increased fire risks. Summer heat made concentrated mental work difficult, while spring and autumn brought agricultural demands that pulled scholars away from their manuscripts and studies. The weight of preserving human knowledge created profound psychological pressure. Monks understood that their work stood between civilization and the loss of centuries of accumulated wisdom. Every damaged manuscript, every copying error, every moment of inattention could result in irreplaceable losses to human understanding and cultural heritage. This intellectual labor, demanding precision, patience, and unwavering dedication, formed the hidden foundation of medieval learning. Behind every preserved text, every copied manuscript, and every piece of transmitted knowledge stood monks, whose minds bore the crushing weight of preserving civilization itself, one carefully formed letter at a time. Across the medieval landscape, certain monasteries rose to prominence, becoming centers of learning, power, and spiritual influence that shaped the course of European history. These institutions were more than mere religious communities. They were the universities, hospitals, libraries, and economic powerhouses of their time. Monte Cassino, founded by Saint Benedict himself around 529 CE, stands as the mother house of Western monasticism. Perched on a rocky hilltop between Rome and Naples, this fortress-like monastery became the birthplace of the Benedictine rule that would govern monastic life for centuries. The monks of Monte Cassino preserved classical texts through the Dark Ages, their scriptorium producing illuminated manuscripts that kept ancient knowledge alive when much of Europe had forgotten how to read. The daily routine at Monte Cassino was particularly rigorous. Monks rose at 2 in the morning for matins, their voices echoing through stone corridors as they chanted in the pre-dawn darkness. The monastery's library contained over 40,000 volumes by the 11th century, making it one of Europe's greatest repositories of learning. Monks spent their days copying texts by hand, their fingers cramped and stained with ink, preserving works of Aristotle, Plato, and Cicero for future generations. In France, the Abbey of Cluny emerged as perhaps the most powerful monastic institution of the medieval period. Founded in 910 CE, Cluny developed into the head of a vast network of monasteries stretching across Europe. At its height, over 10,000 monasteries answered to the abbot of Cluny, creating an ecclesiastical empire that rivaled the authority of kings and emperors. The Cluniac reforms transformed monastic life, emphasizing elaborate liturgical ceremonies and artistic expression. The monks of Cluny spent up to 8 hours daily in choir, their Gregorian chants filling the massive church that was once the largest building in the Christian world. The monastery's wealth was legendary. Its churches gleamed with gold and precious stones, while its kitchens served meals that would have impressed royal courts. Yet this opulence came at a cost. Cluny's monks lived under constant scrutiny, their every movement regulated by an increasingly complex web of rules and customs. The monastery's customary, a detailed guide to daily life, ran to hundreds of pages, dictating everything from how to hold a book to the proper way to sneeze during prayer. Punishment for infractions was swift and severe, with monks subjected to public floggings, solitary confinement, and bread and water diets. In stark contrast to Cluny's magnificence stood the Cistercian monasteries, founded as a reform movement in 1098 CE at Cytox. These white monks, as they were known for their undyed habits, embraced a return to the austere simplicity of early monasticism. Their monasteries were deliberately built in remote valleys and wilderness areas, far from the corrupting influence of secular society. Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire exemplified the Cistercian ideal. Founded in 1132, it became one of the wealthiest monasteries in England through sheep farming and wool production. The monks of Fountains lived lives of extraordinary hardship, sleeping on straw mattresses in unheated dormitories, eating simple meals of bread, vegetables, and water. They worked their own fields, their hands bloody from manual labor, their backs bent from years of agricultural toil. The Cistercians developed revolutionary agricultural techniques, transforming barren landscapes into productive farmland. They built sophisticated systems of canals and mills, pioneered new methods of sheep breeding, and established trade networks that stretched across Europe. Yet their success brought its own challenges, as wealth and worldly concerns gradually eroded their founding principles of poverty and simplicity. Across the English Channel, the monastery of Saint-Denis near Paris became the royal necropolis of France and a center of Gothic architectural innovation. Under Abbot Suger in the 12th century, Saint-Denis pioneered the use of pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses that would define Gothic cathedrals. The monastery's church blazed with colored light, filtering through massive stained glass windows, creating what Suger called a foretaste of heaven on earth. The monks of Saint-Denis lived in the shadow of kings and queens, their daily prayers interrupted by royal ceremonies and state occasions. They maintained the royal tombs, their workshops producing elaborate funeral monuments and precious metalwork. The monastery's treasury contained the crown jewels of France, making it both a spiritual center and a symbol of royal power. In Germany, the monastery of Fulda emerged as a major center of learning and missionary activity. Founded by Saint Boniface in 744 CE, Fulda became known as the Rome of the North for its influence in spreading Christianity throughout Germanic lands. The monastery's school attracted students from across Europe, while its monks ventured into pagan territories as missionaries, often facing martyrdom for their faith. The scholarly monks of Fulda produced some of the finest historical chronicles of the medieval period, their annals providing crucial records of Carolingian history. They developed new forms of manuscript illumination, their artistic innovations spreading throughout the Holy Roman Empire. Yet life at Fulda was harsh, with monks subjected to frequent fasting, corporal punishment, and the constant threat of Viking raids. The Spanish monastery of Santo Domingo de Silos became renowned for its musical traditions, particularly the development of Gregorian chant. The monks spent years perfecting their vocal techniques, their voices trained to produce the pure, otherworldly sounds that characterized medieval liturgy. The monastery's scriptorium produced beautifully illuminated manuscripts, including the famous Beda's commentaries on the Apocalypse, with their vivid depictions of the end times. Life at Silos was marked by extreme asceticism, with monks practicing severe penances and mortifications of the flesh. They wore hair shirts beneath their habits, slept on wooden planks, and subjected themselves to ritual flagellation. The monastery's isolation in the Castilian mountains meant that supplies were often scarce, forcing monks to survive on meager rations of bread, olives, and weak wine. The Irish monastery of Glendalough, founded by Saint Kevin in the 6th century, became a center of Celtic Christianity and learning. Situated in a remote valley surrounded by lakes and mountains, Glendalough attracted pilgrims from across Europe who came to study its unique blend of Christian and Celtic traditions. The monastery's round tower, still standing today, served as both bell tower and refuge during Viking attacks. The monks of Glendalough lived in small stone cells, their lives governed by the harsh Irish climate and the constant threat of Norse raiders. They developed distinctive artistic styles, producing illuminated manuscripts like the Book of Kells, with their intricate Celtic knotwork and fantastical creatures. The monastery's school taught not only Latin and theology, but also Irish law, poetry, and traditional crafts. These great monasteries, each with their unique character and challenges, shaped the medieval world in profound ways. They preserved classical learning through the Dark Ages, pioneered agricultural and architectural innovations and provided the educated administrators that medieval kingdoms desperately needed. Yet behind their grand facades lay the daily reality of monastic life. The endless cycle of prayer and work, the struggle against human weakness and temptation, and the constant effort to maintain spiritual discipline in an increasingly complex world. The monks who inhabited these institutions were not merely passive recipients of tradition, but active shapers of medieval civilization. Through their copying of manuscripts, they preserved the intellectual heritage of antiquity. Through their agricultural innovations, they transformed the European landscape. Through their prayers and penances, they sought to maintain the spiritual foundation upon which medieval society rested. Their lives, marked by both achievement and suffering, illuminate the complex relationship between faith and power, learning and devotion that characterized the medieval world. Throughout the medieval period, certain monks rose above the ordinary rhythms of monastic life to become figures of extraordinary influence and achievement. These individuals, while bound by the same vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience as their brothers, managed to shape theology, politics, literature, and learning in ways that echoed far beyond monastery walls. Perhaps no monk better exemplifies the intellectual power of medieval monasticism than St. Thomas Aquinas. Born into Italian nobility around 1225, Thomas shocked his family by choosing the Dominican order over a more prestigious secular career. His parents were so opposed to his decision that they actually imprisoned him in the family castle for over a year, hoping to change his mind. But Thomas remained steadfast in his calling. Within the monastery, Aquinas developed a systematic approach to theology that would revolutionize Christian thought. His daily routine began at 2 in the morning with matins, followed by hours of prayer, study, and writing. He was known for his ability to dictate to multiple scribes simultaneously, working on different theological treatises at once. His fellow monks often found him so absorbed in contemplation that he would forget to eat, requiring gentle reminders to attend meals in the refectory. Aquinas' masterwork, the Summa Theologica, emerged from this disciplined monastic environment. The text attempted to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine, creating a comprehensive system of theology that the Catholic Church still relies upon today. His work required not just intellectual brilliance, but the patience and persistence that monastic life cultivated. Each day, he would rise before dawn, spend hours in prayer and meditation, then turn to his writing with a clarity of mind that his contemporaries found remarkable. The monastery provided Aquinas with access to extensive libraries and the company of other learned men, but it also imposed the discipline necessary for such monumental intellectual work. His cell was sparse, containing only a writing desk, a few books, and a simple bed. He owned no personal possessions beyond his habit and writing materials. Yet, from this austere environment emerged some of the most sophisticated theological writing in human history. Another towering figure of medieval monasticism was Saint Benedict of Nursia, whose rule became the foundation for Western monastic life. Benedict lived in the 6th century, a time when the Roman Empire was collapsing and barbarian tribes were sweeping across Europe. In this chaos, he created communities of stability and learning that would preserve classical knowledge through the Dark Ages. Benedict's own monastic journey began as a hermit in a cave near Subiaco, where he lived for 3 years in complete solitude. His only human contact was a monk named Romanus, who would lower food to him on a rope. This extreme asceticism prepared Benedict for his later role as an organizer of monastic communities. He understood both the spiritual value of solitude and the practical necessity of community life. When Benedict finally emerged from his hermitage, he began establishing monasteries throughout Italy. His rule, written around 530, provided detailed instructions for every aspect of monastic life, from the hours of prayer to the distribution of food. What made Benedict's rule revolutionary was its moderation. Unlike earlier monastic rules that emphasized extreme asceticism, Benedict created a balanced life of prayer, work, and study that ordinary men could sustain. The daily schedule that Benedict established became the template for monastic life across Europe. Monks would rise at 2 in the morning for vigils, followed by lauds at dawn, prime at sunrise, terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, none in mid-afternoon, vespers at sunset, and compline before bed. Between these prayer services, monks engaged in manual labor, study, and copying manuscripts. This rhythm created communities that were both spiritually focused and economically productive. Benedict's monasteries became centers of learning and agricultural innovation. Monks cleared forests, drained swamps, and developed new farming techniques. They preserved classical texts by copying them in their scriptoriums, maintaining libraries that would later fuel the Renaissance. The stability that Benedict's rule provided allowed these communities to survive invasions, plagues, and political upheavals that destroyed other institutions. In the realm of mystical theology, few figures loom as large as Meister Eckhart, a German Dominican monk who lived from 1260 to 1328. Eckhart's approach to spirituality was so radical that some of his teachings were condemned by the papal court. Yet, his influence on Christian mysticism has been profound and lasting. Eckhart's daily life followed the standard Dominican pattern of prayer, study, and preaching. But his interior spiritual journey was extraordinary. He developed a theology of detachment that went beyond conventional monastic practices. While other monks sought to mortify the flesh and suppress worldly desires, Eckhart taught that true spiritual progress required the complete abandonment of self-will, and even of the desire for salvation itself. His sermons, delivered in German rather than Latin, reached beyond the monastery walls to influence lay Christians throughout the Holy Roman Empire. Eckhart taught that God could be encountered directly through contemplation, without the mediation of church hierarchy or elaborate rituals. This message was both liberating and dangerous, as it suggested that individual monks could achieve direct union with the divine through their own spiritual practices. Within his monastery, Eckhart was known for his intense periods of contemplation. Fellow monks reported that he would sometimes remain motionless in prayer for hours, seemingly oblivious to his surroundings. His cell contained only the most basic furnishings, as he believed that external possessions could distract from inner spiritual development. Even his meals were taken in silence, with his attention focused entirely on the divine presence he believed permeated all existence. The intellectual tradition of monasticism also produced remarkable scholars like Alcuin of York, who became one of the most important figures in the Carolingian Renaissance. Born in Northumbria around 735, Alcuin was educated at the Cathedral School of York before becoming a monk. His reputation for learning eventually reached the court of Charlemagne, who invited him to establish a palace school and reform education throughout the Frankish Empire. Alcuin's daily routine combined traditional monastic practices with intensive scholarly work. He would rise for matins at 2 in the morning, participate in the full cycle of canonical hours, but then spend additional hours teaching, writing, and developing educational curricula. His letters reveal a monk who was deeply committed to his religious vows, while also serving as one of Europe's leading intellectuals. Under Alcuin's guidance, Charlemagne's court became a center of learning that attracted scholars from across Europe. Alcuin developed new methods for teaching Latin grammar and rhetoric, created educational texts that were used throughout the medieval period, and established scriptoriums that produced beautiful illuminated manuscripts. His work helped preserve classical learning and laid the foundation for the intellectual revival that would eventually lead to the establishment of universities. The monastery provided Alcuin with the disciplined environment necessary for such scholarly achievement. The regular rhythm of prayer and communal meals created structure, while the vow of poverty freed him from material concerns. His cell was filled with books and writing materials, but he owned nothing personally. This combination of intellectual resources and spiritual discipline allowed him to produce works that influenced European education for centuries. These famous monks demonstrate how the austere conditions of medieval monastic life could produce extraordinary achievements. The daily rhythm of prayer, work, and study, combined with the discipline of vows and community life, created an environment where exceptional individuals could focus entirely on their spiritual and intellectual development. Their legacies remind us that the harsh conditions of medieval monasteries were not merely punitive, but were designed to cultivate human potential in its highest forms. In our next segment, we'll explore how these monastic communities interacted with broader medieval world, examining their complex relationships with secular authorities, their role in politics, and their influence on medieval society as a whole. The harsh realities of medieval monastic life, with all its physical hardships and spiritual struggles, ultimately shaped far more than just the lives of individual monks. These communities, forged in discipline and sacrifice, became the backbone of medieval civilization itself. The preservation of knowledge stands as perhaps the most visible legacy of these dedicated communities. While Europe descended into the chaos of the Dark Ages, monks continued their painstaking work in scriptoriums, copying ancient texts by candlelight through long winter nights. Their cramped fingers traced Latin letters onto parchment, preserving the works of Aristotle, Plato, and countless other classical authors who might otherwise have been lost forever. But their contributions extended far beyond simple preservation. Monastic libraries became centers of learning, where new ideas flourished alongside ancient wisdom. The brutal schedule that demanded intellectual work between prayers created an environment where scholarship could thrive, even under the most challenging conditions. Monks didn't just copy texts, they analyzed, commented upon, and expanded the knowledge they preserved. The agricultural innovations developed within monastery walls revolutionized medieval farming. The same communities that rose before dawn for matins also pioneered crop rotation techniques, improved plowing methods, and selective breeding practices. Their vast land holdings became testing grounds for agricultural experimentation, driven by the practical need to feed growing communities while maintaining their vows of poverty. Monastic communities established the first hospitals, developing medical knowledge through necessity. When brothers fell ill from their harsh lifestyle, monastery infirmaries became centers of healing that served not just the religious community, but surrounding populations. The same herbs grown in monastery gardens for seasoning simple meals became the foundation of medieval medicine. The economic impact of these communities cannot be overstated. Despite their vows of poverty, monasteries became major economic forces, managing vast estates, operating mills, and engaging in trade networks that spanned continents. The discipline that governed their spiritual lives extended to their business practices, creating institutions of remarkable efficiency and longevity. The educational legacy of medieval monasteries laid the groundwork for the university system that would emerge in the later medieval period. The same communities that enforced silence during meals and prayers also maintained schools that educated not just future monks, but lay students as well. Their emphasis on literacy and learning created the intellectual foundation upon which medieval civilization was built. Perhaps most significantly, these communities demonstrated that alternative ways of living were possible. In an age dominated by feudalism and violence, monasteries offered a different model of society based on cooperation, shared purpose, and spiritual dedication. Their success in creating stable, productive communities influenced secular governance and social organization throughout medieval Europe. The architectural legacy of these communities continues to inspire awe today. The same monks who slept on straw mattresses and ate simple meals also created some of the most magnificent buildings in human history. Gothic cathedrals, Romanesque abbeys, and illuminated manuscripts represent artistic achievements that emerged directly from the harsh discipline of monastic life. The influence of medieval monasticism extended far beyond Europe's borders. Missionary monks carried their traditions to Ireland, Scotland, and eventually to the far reaches of the known world. Their willingness to endure hardship for spiritual purpose created a network of communities that facilitated cultural exchange and the spread of ideas across vast distances. Modern monastic communities continue many of the same practices that defined medieval monastery life. The same bells that called medieval monks to prayer still ring in monasteries around the world. The same vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience continue to attract individuals seeking spiritual fulfillment through discipline and sacrifice. The psychological insights developed through centuries of monastic practice have influenced modern understanding of meditation, contemplation, and spiritual development. The brutal self-examination that characterized medieval monastic life contributed to sophisticated understanding of human psychology and spiritual growth that remains relevant today. Contemporary movements toward sustainable living and environmental consciousness often draw inspiration from monastic practices. The same communities that made do with simple meals and basic shelter also developed sustainable agricultural practices and resource management techniques that modern environmentalists study and adapt. The social services provided by medieval monasteries established precedents for modern welfare systems. Their commitment to caring for the poor, sick, and elderly created institutional models that influenced the development of hospitals, schools, and charitable organizations throughout the Western world. The discipline and routine that characterized monastic life have influenced modern approaches to productivity and personal development. The same principles that helped medieval monks maintain their demanding schedule continue to inform contemporary understanding of habit formation and goal achievement. The intellectual traditions developed within monastery walls contributed to the emergence of scholasticism, the philosophical movement that would dominate medieval thought. The same communities that enforced strict silence also fostered the development of logical reasoning and systematic theology that shaped Western intellectual tradition. The artistic traditions that emerged from monastic communities continue to influence contemporary art and design. The illuminated manuscripts created by monks working in cold scriptoriums represent some of the finest examples of medieval art, combining technical skill with spiritual devotion in ways that continue to inspire artists today. The legacy of medieval monasticism reminds us that human beings are capable of extraordinary dedication and sacrifice when united by shared purpose and spiritual conviction. These communities, forged in hardship and sustained by faith, created institutions that outlasted kingdoms and empires, leaving an indelible mark on human civilization that continues to influence our world today. As we reflect on the brutal realities of medieval monastic life, we must also acknowledge the profound impact these communities had on shaping the world we inhabit. Their legacy extends far beyond the monastery walls, touching every aspect of human knowledge, culture, and spiritual understanding in ways that continue to resonate across the centuries. As we draw the curtains on this lengthy exploration of medieval monastic life, we find ourselves contemplating the profound contradictions that defined these sacred communities. The monasteries stood as beacons of learning and spirituality in an age of darkness. Yet they harbored practices that would seem impossibly harsh by today's standards. The monks we've encountered throughout this journey were neither saints nor sinners, but human beings caught between the demands of earthly existence and heavenly aspirations. Their daily routines, marked by prayer bells and punctuated by moments of quiet desperation, reveal the timeless struggle between flesh and spirit that has defined religious life across centuries. Consider the young novice we met earlier, awakening before dawn to the sound of wooden clappers echoing through stone corridors. His journey from eager postulant to weathered brother encapsulates the transformation that monastic life demanded. The initial enthusiasm gradually tempered by the relentless rhythm of communal prayer, manual labor, and self-denial. The monastery walls that provided protection from worldly chaos also created their own unique forms of suffering. The silence that was meant to bring them closer to God sometimes drove men to the brink of madness. The communal life, designed to foster brotherhood, often bred petty jealousies and bitter rivalries that simmered beneath the surface of forced piety. Yet within these constraints, remarkable achievements flourished. The same hands that trembled during midnight vigils also carefully copied manuscripts that preserved ancient wisdom. The minds that struggled with doubt and despair also produced theological insights that would influence Christianity for generations to come. The agricultural innovations developed in monastery fields fed not only the religious community, but entire regions. The hospitals and schools established by these institutions provided care and education when secular authorities offered little. The brewing techniques perfected in abbey kitchens created beverages that sustained communities through harsh winters and long fasting periods. The economic networks established by monastic orders created trade routes that connected distant lands and cultures. The architectural marvels they constructed still inspire awe today, standing as monuments to human determination and divine aspiration. Their libraries became repositories of knowledge that bridged the gap between classical antiquity and the Renaissance. Perhaps most remarkably, the psychological resilience developed through monastic discipline created individuals capable of extraordinary endurance. The same training that seemed to break the human spirit also forged characters of remarkable strength and determination. The monks who survived the rigors of medieval religious life emerged as leaders, scholars, and spiritual guides who shaped the course of European civilization. The legacy of these medieval monasteries extends far beyond their historical period. Modern concepts of scheduled work, communal living, and institutional organization owe much to monastic innovations. The idea that education should be available to all, regardless of social status, first took root in monastery schools. The notion that caring for the sick and poor was a social responsibility was largely developed within abbey walls. As we've seen throughout this exploration, the brutal aspects of monastic life were inseparable from its transformative power. The physical hardships, emotional isolation, and spiritual struggles that defined daily existence in medieval monasteries were not merely obstacles to overcome, but integral components of a system designed to reshape human nature itself. The bells that called monks to prayer at all hours of the day and night have long since fallen silent in many of these ancient institutions. The dormitories that once housed hundreds of religious brothers now stand empty or serve secular purposes. Yet the echoes of their experiences continue to resonate through history, reminding us of humanity's capacity for both suffering and transcendence. In closing, we're reminded that the medieval monastery represented one of history's most ambitious experiments in human transformation. Whether we view it as a noble attempt to create heaven on earth or a misguided effort to deny fundamental human nature, we cannot ignore its profound impact on the development of Western civilization. And with that reflection, we conclude our journey through the cloistered world of medieval monasticism. May your own rest be more peaceful than theirs ever was.